I'm just going to pose a question, Grace, to you and to everybody. There's so much going on in the world today. At one time I thought, much like Michael said, that everything happened in the 60s, and all we could try to do as younger people was try to sort of recreate that moment again. And yet there's so much change going on in the world today, so much repression and destruction, and yet so much sense for hope and optimism. So we think about what's going on now in Libya, following Egypt, and throughout the rest of the Middle East. Some people have called this a revolutionary moment in the Middle East or around the world. We think about all of the new measures being put in place to bust unions in Wisconsin and Ohio and other places around the country, and yet all of the thousands of people that have been coming out in protest of that. And of course, we've seen this incredibly destructive natural disaster in Japan that also has a huge social disaster on top of it now with the nuclear accidents as well. So taking any of those as an example of the state of the world today, how can we look at any of these, Middle East, Wisconsin, Japan, put that into some kind of context of what it means to think about the concept of revolution today, how we might need a richer concept. So I'll let Grace start, and if you guys want to add anything, please feel free.
Well, the first thing I think we need to do is to rethink what a revolution is. I think we tend to think that masses of people, and the more the people, the better, is what a revolution is all about. And that reveals a way of thinking that we have to leave behind. Margaret Wheatley, who is a wonderful woman, said that according to Newtonian physics, it's how you increase the mass of the people who are involved. So we get all excited when we see thousands of people. We think we have to add more people. But she says, according to quantum physics, it's critical connections, not critical mass. And I wish you'd think about that, because you can make critical connections with your neighbors. You can make critical connections with your family. You can make critical connections with those who are close to you. You don't have to think in terms of, are they of the right class? Or are they the right gender? You don't have to think in those structural terms. You can relate in a human way to other people. And we're at a point in the evolution of humanity and in the evolution of the concept of revolution, where we have to think much more in terms of critical connections. We have to think much more in terms of beloved community, and how if we think differently, let me give you an example. In Detroit and all over the country, they think of young people as a problem. If you think of young people as a problem rather than as a solution, you're in a lot of trouble. You begin putting locks on all the doors of the school. In Detroit, they're even thinking of having prison cells in the schools. It's not only that the schools are a pipeline to prison, as they are today, but they're actually going to criminalize young people as a generation. And it's so necessary under those circumstances to think differently about education. It's so necessary to think differently about young people, to see how, if we look at them differently, if we enable them to see themselves differently, they become the solution. They become the citizens that can begin to solve the problems of our dying cities, as Martin Luther King put it in one of his last speeches.
Other questions? No, here come the questions. Go ahead. Okay. Just one short thing. I really wanted to hear the questions, but he was telling me we don't have them yet, so I can fill up the time. Which is, I at least part of the question that Scott asked, I was thinking about how it's often seemed misdirected to me, or partly reflecting on what Grace just said, the way the Egyptian and Tunisian experiences in the last month or so have been called revolutions. I mean, one of the really great things I think that had happened, and one of the things that excited me, is that the events, especially in Tunisia and Egypt, swept away a certain fundamentally racist assumptions that Arabs politically are only capable of either a kind of religious fanatic government or obeying some authoritarian government. That in a way that they've demonstrated, in a way that the revolts have demonstrated a political capacity for inventing democratic forms. But my feeling is that they've been called relentlessly revolutions in the mainstream media, and I think that has cast them as a kind of repetition of European history, as if they were going to obey the rules of 1789 or 1917 or some other. In some ways, calling them revolution has blocked understanding what's really going on, like blocked recognizing it as new. Maybe there you go. That's different, though, that what Grace is talking about, which does seem to me, I like this idea of we have to reinvent revolution, or rather, you could put it another way, that anyone who tells you they understand what revolution is, don't trust them. That it has to be, that it is something that has to be invented. And I would say also, if Tunisia and Egypt, and if only Libya, could become revolutionary situations, it would have to be something that comes after the revolt, that comes after the toppling of the dictator, and something that like Grace said too, is a much longer constituent process of constructing, of inventing a new society, which isn't there yet.
Okay, so there are a lot of questions. I'm going to try to get to as many of them as possible, though we'll be here for the rest of the weekend in all types of capacities discussing many of these questions. So the first one is asking us to compare whether we need to be focusing on unifying the left or fighting the Tea Party. How do you choose between these priorities?
Do you want to read several at a time, or do you want to? I'll try to do that next. Okay.
I'd like to address that question of unity. You know, people quote Frederick Douglass, without struggle there is no progress. And they usually think only of struggle against the opposition, against the enemy, against the counter-revolution. I interpret that differently. I think we have to struggle among ourselves. And I think the extent to which we make unity the goal limits our capacity and our need to rethink. Because, you know, I was doing an interview with some people on Nkrumah the other day, and I think back to the struggles for independence and how the independence leaders thought that if, in Africa particularly, that if they were able to take over the government, everything would be granted to them. And yet I don't think the revolution actually started in Kenya and in Africa until Wangari Maathai started the Green Belt movement. The men who led the independence struggles were mostly Bantous. They're mostly people who had been to the United States or to Europe. They had very Western ideas of what progress was. They wanted to catch up. They wanted Africa to catch up with the North. And they ignored the women who lived in the rural areas and who were the ones who fetched the water and the wood, and therefore had a very different view of the environment. And so when Wangari Maathai went back to Africa after being in this country during the last years of the Civil Rights Movement, she began to organize the women She was divorced by her husband as a witch because she challenged the male leaders. She began to organize the women. You know, she got a Nobel Prize in 2004. And they began to relate to their environment and to their daily needs. And the result was the emergence of women's groups, small groups, all over Africa. That, to me, is the future of Africa and also of North Africa. It's very exciting to see the demonstrations in Tahrir Square. It's very exciting to see the large numbers of people who come out to Madison, Wisconsin, and protest Scott Walker and the denial of collective bargaining. But these protests tend to be mainly defensive of the past. And we are at a time in the clock of the world when we have the opportunity to create another future.
Okay, try to group some of these together. These questions are, what do you see as the barriers to the paradigm shift needed in a radical revolution of values? What do you tell non-political friends who don't question the system at all? So these questions, you know, the struggle, the difficulty. How do you...
Michael, why don't you handle that?
You know, what do you tell non-political friends? Well, okay, here's a place to start. I don't know if this was the right one. I remember being quite frustrated with activist friends in the 1980s when it seemed like activism, that our being political was always, and our activism was always about a kind of duty and self-denial yeah, it was a kind of moralizing that seemed like, you know, about recognizing all of the, continually recognizing both in society and ourselves all of the forms of domination, etc. And it took me a while then, and this took me again, I had to go outside the U.S. to understand this political struggle as a joy, as a life of joy. Like the political struggle wasn't, and so that what I would say to non-political friends is it would be rather like, oh, it's your duty, you should do politics, something like that. You know, like, no, it's rather like what you're missing, like what the pleasures and joys of the struggle for change. I mean, even calling it struggle then makes it sound like something. Of course, it's tiring and everything, but I mean, these two could actually explain this much better than I, what the joys of a revolutionary life are, and how it's and how much so much better than sitting on the couch. There you go.
Okay, there are several questions on the topic of education. So first, thinking about places like Detroit, where the public education system is in so much crisis, so many things are being privatized. There's a plan right now to turn about 40 Detroit schools into charter schools over the next 3 to 6 months, which would be a very radical undertaking. And of course, there are many schools being closed. So how do we think about the crisis to public education? And at the same time, while people are fighting against privatization and the defunding of schools, how do we deal with the fact that the schools themselves are so riddled with problems even to begin with? And more broadly, people want to think about the role of education in the process of organizing and making revolution. How do we think about revolution as an educational process? So feel free to wax on those.
Anyone? Oh, sorry. In Detroit, something like 10,000 students drop out every year. Each one of those students represents $6,000 to $7,000 in state aid. So you can imagine the fiscal crisis that we are in. And you can imagine how people think, as the financial manager, emergency financial manager, Bob thinks, we'll close schools. We'll break the union. They think of all these ways, economic ways, to solve what they think is an economic problem. It's very hard for them to understand that schools are a relatively recent development in human history. There was a long period during which kids were part of the society. They were smaller, but they participated. In the medieval period, they learned from the guilds, they learned skills. So we think that the way that we live, the way that we think of education as a means to get a job and for upward mobility is permanent. That's the way people should think. That's how we should reorganize our schools. And a lot of people have a lot of stake in that. I mean, people think in terms of jobs, the millions of jobs that are provided by the school system. They have an economic stake in it. And so it's very hard for them to make a paradigm shift and to understand that once we enlist young people in what is called place-based education, and once we enlist them in solving problems, and once we understand that they are potential citizens, and that while they're in school, there's no reason why they should be practicing citizenship, we begin making a paradigm shift. And it becomes the only way in which we can avoid our schools being turned into prisons. And that's what's beginning to happen in Detroit. We had a huge, wonderful meeting last night at the Bach Center on another education's happening, where we learned about the things that people are actually doing to create another kind of education. So don't wait for Arnie Duncan. Don't wait for Obama. Don't wait for anybody in the White House to solve this problem. It's an opportunity for us to change the way we look at children, to change the way we look at education, and to begin to close that gap between the age groups, which has been one of the reasons for our growing devastation in this society over the last period.
Okay. I'm going to connect two threads from a number of questions. The first is to think about all of the abandonment in cities like Detroit. We don't have a glitzy entertainment district like Times Square. We don't have any big shopping malls. We don't have really more than a handful of even big box stores. And there's not even a single corporate grocery chain in the city of Detroit itself. So there's so much abandonment. People want to know, what is the significance of that? Why is that happening? And at the same time, people are asking questions about how do we, if we know there's something wrong with inequality and the rule of private ownership and private property over our lives, how do we think about alternatives? What does this concept of the commons, mean, and how do we make that meaningful? So, maybe Michael, you can start on this.
These are really hard questions. I'm thinking. Oh, I don't have a good way of starting. Do you have a way of starting? And then I'll go. I mean, in a way, how. I mean, in some ways, the question is asking us to reflect on how the abandonment of the city has been met with an autonomous construction of alternative city. I mean, that's what seems most interesting to me in what's been happening in Detroit? I mean, one could go through, it's partly also asking, but this seems more a different kind of answer. Why is it that corporations have withdrawn from, and why have certain populations withdrawn from Detroit? That seems less interesting to me than how the possibilities of this of an autonomous reinvention and a creation of a common city that not a private city. That seems to me what's much more interesting in what's going on, the construction of an alternative Detroit.
You know, I'm going to use a phrase that I very often use, that Detroit was once a national and international symbol of the miracles of industrialization. And then we became a national and international symbol of the devastation of deindustrialization. And now we're becoming a national and international symbol of hope, of something new emerging out of abandonment and devastation. And I think that the impulse very often is to think that the attacks of the counter-revolution or the devastation of deindustrialization are negatives. And it's very true, they are negatives. But one of the most important things I learned in my first year of graduate school was reading Hegel's Phenomenology, and in which he explained that you don't get to the absolute or to self-determination or to freedom like a shot out of a pistol. You have to go through the labor, patience, and suffering of the negative. And I think to welcome the opportunity and to respond to the negative as granting you an opportunity to make a great change in human evolution is where we are in the clock of the world. It's another way of thinking. We have the opportunity to make a evolutionary change in what it means to be a human being that's not just anatomical. We think of evolution mainly in anatomical terms. You begin to walk on your 2 legs rather than 4. But I think it's the way that we think. You know, in the book Revolution and Evolution in the 20th Century, Chapter 6 is called Dialectics and Revolution. And it's written by Jimmy. And he says, it was published 30 years before 9/11. He says the revolution to be made in the United States is not going to be like any other revolutions in the past. It will not be to acquire more things, but it will be to understand how much of the comforts and conveniences that we have acquired have been at the expense of other people's and of the rest of the world. And until we understand that, he said, we will be facing terror. And I think the rest of the world has awakened. I think that we are in the midst, we're living in a dying empire. We're living when the kinds, and that's to be welcome. Because we have gathered our comforts and conveniences, and our empire has expanded at the expense of other people's and of the rest of the world. And how to meet that crisis with dignity and democracy rather than with fear and trembling is the challenge that we face. And to welcome it, to seize it, to seize the time, as the Panthers used to say, as an opportunity. It's a joy, as Michael said.
Michael, maybe on the commons question, I mean, maybe you could explain, since you've written about this quite a bit, what do we mean by the commons? Does it mean, single-payer healthcare for everyone? Does it mean socialism, or is there something new about this idea of the commons that you're trying to communicate?
Right. Okay, so Tony, my co-author, and I are trying to think about something that's an alternative to property, and both an alternative to public property, meaning state control, or private property, and with the idea that our general social understandings are sort of myopic and they see the world only as public or private in these sense. You know, either it's controlled by the state or it's controlled by private property, and instead, much of the world already, we argue, is already common in the sense that it's open and shared and constructed, like Grace was saying before, about the intensity of relation. I can't remember exact terms from quantum physics, but it's something about the intensity of relations together, which are already common, not controlled by property, either public or private. This would link both, let's say, on the one hand, the common thought of as the earth and its ecosystems, the water, the forests, etc., an ancient, really, notion of the common, but also the common thought of even the pinnacle of capitalist production today, the production of ideas, of images, of code, even of affects, that these are central to capitalist production, but they all are tendentially common, like that ideas are and code or music or images are shareable, you know, and then a way making them, they are only productive really also insofar as they're shared and shareable. So it's, I guess that for us trying to see two things, but I guess trying to see the common that already exists, and then also to construct a political project that's oriented towards that, the autonomy and the construction of common relationships and common spaces and common goods. It's a...
Michael, would you tell folks what you mean by biopolitical production in Commonwealth? It's a very difficult concept to grasp, I know, for people who've read it.
We're trying to recognize the way this does come back to Detroit in a way, in the way that you were talking about the transformation of the city, that there was a long period in which industry dominated other forms of production in society as a whole, that the qualities of industry for a very long period have been imposed over the rest of society, you know, that other industries, agriculture had to mechanize, had to develop even the temporalities of the industrial world, you know, the notion of the working day, of work division between work time and non-work time, was all in a way created by industry and the predominance of industry. Okay. Today, industry is no longer in such a dominant position. In some ways, Detroit is an emblem of that. That it doesn't mean that there are no longer factories. You know, there are, of course, many people in the factories today, but it means that there are other sectors of capitalist production that are now becoming more dominant, or this is our claim, me and Tony's claim, that they're, and this is what we link together as calling it biopolitical production, or we sometimes say immaterial production, which is a bad term too. But what we mean is that the production of goods that are primarily immaterial, like the production of ideas, or the production of code, or even the production of affects, like in healthcare or education itself. I mean, what educators do is, of course, well, do we do anything material? I'm not really sure. The healthcare workers do. They stitch up wounds, they change bedpans, but a lot of what they do is producing affects, you know, producing a sense of well-being, etc. In education, a lot of our production is immaterial. And anyway, the idea is that rather than industry today, this immaterial or biopolitical production, the production of new forms of life, is becoming central in capitalist production, which for us, sorry for the long detour through all these things, it means that these goods that are potentially common or even intrinsically common, like affects and ideas and code and these things that are now becoming central in capitalist production, it provide an opportunity for the construction of the project of a social transformation based on these common goods. You know, like, for instance, think of, I mean, the Detroit auto worker. That the Detroit auto worker really could organize autonomously, could even run the factory autonomously, something like that, but you're really limited by the site of production. I mean, you could The Detroit auto worker could only make cars at the factory. I mean, you can't go home and make a little car in your garage. I mean, there's a certain link, there's a way in which capital organized the production process and organized and provided the cooperation and organized people together. What I think we're seeing increasingly, or this is what Tony and I argue, is that the forms of production that are becoming predominant today are ones in which capital in some senses withdrawn or external. It still it still makes horrible constraints on you. I'm not saying that working in a 7-Eleven or a call center, which are really just kind of immaterial production too, is great. No, but it's our own ingenuity and our own connections that are increasingly prominent, whereas in industry we were constrained in a different way. All that to say, or at least the point that comes around here, is that trying to see in the forms of this changing economic paradigm, like in the newly dominant forms of production that we're calling biopolitical or immaterial, there are new possibilities for autonomy. There are new possibilities for taking control of these social productions ourselves. That's where it's coming around to.
I don't know how many people have read Multitudes. I love that book. In Multitudes, Michael and Deborah Negri explained that we should not be thinking of organizations like the Third International or Lenin's Leningrad Party to organize the revolution. That because we're in this very new stage where we're really struggling against our commodification by global capitalism. I mean, all over the world, communities, small communities, to protect their humanity and their communities against commodification are organizing in little groups. So solidarity has to take a very different meaning. We have thought of solidarity mainly as marching side by side. What we have to do now is to recognize how all over the world people are defending their humanity against commodification. A wonderful book in this connection is Global Harvest by Paul Hawken, which I recommend to you. There are millions of people engaged in this struggle. We don't have to wait for the Third International, or the Fourth International, or the Fifth International.
We're going to try to get to a couple more questions. I just want to give you a preview of what's coming up. So there'll be a reception and a book signing afterwards. At 7 o'clock, we're going to do some short film screenings, including a sneak preview of a new documentary that's still a work in progress. You'll get a chance to see some of it for the very first time. And this is a documentary on Grace Lee Boggs, which is being made by filmmaker Grace Lee from Los Angeles, who's here with us. So stick around for that. And at 7:30, we just have an incredibly amazing show, which is absolutely free and worth much, much more than that, with some amazing student performers. There's also our featured performers, Nobuko Miyamoto, who's going to give us a multimedia history of the Asian American movement, as well as West Coast rappers Geologic from the legendary group Blue Scholars, and Kiwi from the Bay Area, and they'll be backed by DJ Fatrick. So stick around for that at 7:30. Couple more questions, hopefully we can get in. First question, people want to know about the changing place of Asia in the world economy and world politics. What does that mean? And particularly, does it have any implications for Asians in the United States?
I think it's a time when Asian Americans have a whole lot to contribute to Asia. You know, my father came here like many Chinese peasants because this was the Golden Mountain. The United States was the zenith of civilization. And though we were a very small minority, we were almost invisible, the goal was to become like this country all over the world. And that's no longer the case. And we who are Asian Americans and who have experienced what at what expense people of color, Native Americans, African Americans, and also Asian Americans suffered in order to achieve this economic growth, and who understand how it's ended in the devastation of Detroit and created the opportunity to begin the world anew. I think we have a lot to tell the people of Asia. I have had folks come to the Bog Center who are scholars in this country, and they are like children in a playground. They sense there's something new happening here. And I think we Asian Americans particularly can carry that message. We have a responsibility also, because what happened in Japan, what's happening to the skies over Beijing and Shanghai, are a warning that the world needs to begin anew.
Okay, I think I'll just pose the last question, and I'm going to ask, we'll go down the line and ask you all to address it. It unites many, many of the questions here, and they're particularly coming from younger people, at least from what I can tell from the way the questions posed. So, in 2008, of course, we elected Barack Obama, first African-American president, replaced George W. Bush. There was so much work that went into it, so many young people that came out, people of color, new voters, and there was so much optimism that the sense that this was part of some grand transformative change, right? Not just the election, but what would come next. Since that time, people, on the one hand, have seen this huge backlash from the right wing, the Tea Party. We had questions about that. At the same time, there's a lot of disillusionment or pessimism on the part of people who felt like they did a lot of work, and they're constantly disappointed by Obama's compromises or his giving in or his sort of lack of nerve. And there are a lot of questions saying, what should young people do? What should I do? How can I make a difference? So, you know, some directly in relationship to what's happened since 2008, some just more generally thinking, at a point in my life, I realize the need for change. Where do we start? So let's start with Michael Hart.
I was trying to remember the exact quote. I was thinking of this makes me think of a large book by Ernst Bloch, a German Marxist, called The Principle of Hope. And he says something, and it's something like, it's really the moment of the disappointment of hope when the real work begins. And I think that's an interesting thing to think about with Obama, that the disappointment of hope's not a bad thing. I mean, it's not that there was, I don't like the narrative that, oh, there was all this hope, and then disappointment, which leads to somehow inaction, or as if the hope itself was naive or something like that. No, I think that the disappointment of hope is the great energy of transformation. Like, it's good to be disappointed by Obama. I think you should be disappointed. Like, but that doesn't mean that the hope itself was wrong. No, that now focuses it into a different register. I mean, the obvious things, there are certain things that come to mind that are just the obvious things, which I think the person asking the question is obviously thinking of, that the great mobilizations that went into the election of Obama do not indicate, you know, now that there's someone representing us, we can all go home and just sit around while that person represents us, but that rather, of course, that's only the initiation of the struggle. It's in this way that I've been thinking for some years, or since the election of Obama, that I think it'd be great if North America would Latin Americanize. I mean, the way I've seen the struggles in Latin America over the last 10 years have been social movements that force the election of progressive governments, but that then don't stop, and that what is developed is a kind of antagonistic engagement between social movements and leftist governments. Then the social movements, in fact, constantly pushing them farther, but rather than assuming that there would be some sort of representation. That would be my highest hope for what could happen in the U.S. during the Obama presidency, would be that kind of becoming more like a Latin American country. I'm thinking of whatever, Brazil, Argentina, Bolivia, Ecuador, Paraguay, a number of these progressive governments in which the social movements are a constant force, antagonistic force to the government that push them forward. Oh, you got one already.
To me, I have to believe at this point that I'm talking about the young people who did support Obama, have to come up with a solution, and a new solution. I have supported Obama and even worked for him actively. But while I was working for Obama and all that change he was talking about that I wanted to see as well, I had no illusions that Obama could get in the office and change the system that systematically oppresses me. So let me say, my hope is in you finding a way that we can change ourselves and the system that oppresses us to make a better world. Let me leave it at that. Thank you.
Well, during the inauguration in 2009, Amy Goodman and Alice Walker televised the proceedings, and they called me and asked me what I thought. And I watched Obama's face as he took his seat on the platform. It was very grim, it was very sad, and I think he understood that he was entering a trap. And I think we need to understand and draw the lessons of this, not bemoan it so much, as understand that the electoral system and democracy of which Obama's ascendancy to the presidency is a part is only a step on the expansion of democracy. We have to move beyond electoral democracy to a more participatory democracy. We have to be assuming responsibilities for making decisions that matter to us and to the rest of the world. And we haven't been doing that. We have what Sheldon Wallen calls an inverted totalitarianism, because we're not participants in making decisions. We are leaving it to others.